All right, everybody, it's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show, brought to you by the Skeptic Society. We are a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization. Please go to skeptic.com/donate and give us a little support there. You can order your magazine. We are still in print, one of the few magazines still in print. You can go to a bookstore and pick this up, or you can just go to skeptic.com/magazine and we'll ship it to you right from that bookshelf over there at our offices here in Santa Barbara, California. Latest issue on artificial intelligence. Is that a cool cover or what? It was designed by an artificial intelligence. How's that for a meta? That's crazy. Okay, my guest today is, yay, I wanted to have him for a long time, Bradley Campbell. He's a professor of sociology at Cal State University, Los Angeles. His work examines moral conflict, including violent conflicts such as genocide, as well as nonviolent conflicts on college campuses. You may have noticed those, over politics and free speech. He's the author of The Geometry of Genocide, a study in pure sociology, and co-author of The Rise of Victimhood Culture, Microaggressions, Safe Spaces, and the New Culture Wars. He was one of the first to identify what went wrong on college campuses. That must have been, maybe 8 years ago that book was published now? 6? Something like that, Bradley?
The book was published in 2018, but we had published an article in 2014 about it.
That's right. I think I came across it first maybe through Jonathan Haidt's. Was it the Coddling book? I think he talked about it in the Coddling book.
Yeah, he talked about it in the Coddling book, and he had written about it a bit before that, about our article. So.
Yeah. Well, here's the new book. Here's why he's on: How to Think Better About Social Justice. Right. I've done a number of episodes on this show about related topics, identity politics and wokeness and that sort of thing, mostly conservatives. None of the progressives will talk to me. I mean, I get close to booking them. The publicist sends me the book. We find a date and so on. Then at the last minute, something comes up. It's so frustrating because I'm trying to get, I don't want to hear just from Christopher Rufo or, some of these thinkers. I got to hear from the other side. Well, I have the next best thing because you're pretty neutral about this whole subject. So let's just start there. How did you get interested in studying this from a scientific perspective or sociological perspective?
I think originally when we started studying what we ended up calling victimhood culture, we were, Jason Manning was my co-author on The Rise of Victimhood Culture. And we first started we were curious about the idea of microaggression, and we had, we were looking at it from the standpoint of moral sociologists. We're interested in morality and moral conflict from a sociological standpoint. And because both of us have taught about and written about violence, we had talked a lot about and read a lot about cultures of honor, where people fight duels and things like this. And historians and sociologists had talked about how honor had given way to what they'd called dignity, so a culture of honor to a culture of dignity. So in honor cultures, you had people being very sensitive to slight and fighting in response to insults. In dignity cultures, you were told to ignore slights. If it's a serious injury, use the law. And we thought it was interesting from that standpoint that people were focusing on what they called microaggressions, which were supposed to be small slights that were putting down an ethnic group or something else, but the idea was that they added up over time and caused great harm. But the emphasis on small slights and on exposing those seemed to be something that wasn't really in line with honor or dignity. It was in honor cultures, people are interested in very small slights against them, but they respond violently. They respond themselves. And here you had people kind of publicizing it, putting them on websites, asking university authorities to do things about them. And so, and there was that. There was also the idea of safe spaces. All these things that everybody knows about now. People didn't know about that much in late 2014 when we first wrote about this. And so we said there was kind of a new moral culture among those activists that we ended up calling victimhood culture. People don't always like the term, especially if they're more favorable to that. But the idea was that victimhood was acting as a kind of status. And what you saw in among these activists was an emphasis on small slights, just like you might see in honor cultures, but an emphasis on appealing to authorities to intervene, which was something different. And so we wrote about that and tried to give some sociological explanation for why we were seeing the changes. And of course, then that was like late 2014. And then in the fall of 2015 and kind of several years thereafter, these things kind of started exploding on college campuses. And there were a number of high-profile cases with Nicholas Christakis at Yale, Brett Weinstein, and all these cases that kind of got a lot of attention. People were saying, "What's happening?" And so our work was sort of available to try to explain it.
Yeah, I've been tracking this myself for years, and it's not clear to me what the base rate of these events are and how much above the base rate they are since, say, 2015. In other words, you can cite those specific cases like, oh my God, that's completely insane. But when I was doing a lot of college talks before COVID, you just walk around these college campuses, you don't see anything like that. Most of them, they're just holed up in their dorms, or they're at the gym, or they're at the Starbucks, and they're just, everything is bucolic and peaceful and nice. But maybe it doesn't take many of those incidents to have a trend or something like that.
And it's other things too. I mean, those are the kind of the high profile incidents. Yes, day-to-day life on a college campus is pretty much like it used to be. And so it's not as if every speaker gets shouted down, those kinds of things. But you do see kind of, one thing you see is the institutionalization of a lot of the stuff, the creation of DEI offices. You've seen in the University of California system, people having to to kind of demonstrate their commitment to diversity and inclusion in a very kind of ideological way as a condition of getting the job. These diversity statements that people are required. There's lots of examples of the spread beyond just the big events. But that's kind of how we. I mean, before that, I was writing about violence and genocide, but I was always interested in moral conflicts, and so clashes about right and wrong. And so I approached it from that standpoint. Now, I have commented, I think a lot of these are, a lot of those trends I see as negative, and I have talked about free speech implications and those kinds of things, especially the things that concern college campuses that I have spoken on. But in the book, The Rise of Victimhood Culture, it was really, we were simply trying to understand, to describe and explain what was happening. And then so what I've done since then is, I've continued to follow this, but I've also thought about how people might approach social justice issues better. A lot of people are influenced by, what I think of as critical social justice. This is what a lot of the activists call it, so I don't think I'm mischaracterizing it. Many who are critical of it call it wokeism or something like that now. But I've tried to understand, what parts of it are they taking from sociology, mostly from critical theory within sociology or the social sciences. And I've tried to explain why I think that's not the best approach to social justice issues. And so it's sort of, there will be people who are very committed to critical social justice, but there are a lot of people who are influenced by it lately. They want to change the world for the better. These are the people making a case for doing that. And so I'm trying to say, well, this is how you might think better about social justice. I think sociology, social science more broadly, can be useful in thinking about social justice. I think critical theory isn't as useful, especially not when it's kind of used exclusively. And so that's what I've tried to explain in the new book.
Yeah, we'll dive into that in a second, but I want to get your thoughts on updating your hypothesis about victimhood culture in the context of the spike in teen depression, suicidality, anxiety, cutting, anorexia, and so on that everybody's talking about. John Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generations, came out. Abigail Shrier's book, Bad Therapy. Jean Twangy's book, Generations. These are different. Maybe it's overdetermined. Maybe we don't really know yet at the moment. But, would the rise of victimhood culture be along the lines of the kids are coddled? They're not as strong or anti-fragile or resilient as they used to be because of this victimhood culture? Is that part of it? And what do you think about these generational differences that Jean Twenge talks about, or the pathologizing of normal teen anxiety and depression, sadness? Now you have social anxiety disorder. Oh, I have this disorder. At Chapman, when I was teaching there, I'd get 2 or 3 letters every semester. So-and-so has social anxiety disorders. You have to excuse them from giving any talks or exchanging conversations in class. It's like, what is going on here? So give us your thoughts on all that.
I think, as you said, it sometimes seems overdetermined, and that is an issue which is, we just have to deal with it. But if you're dealing with these large scale trends and things, you can almost point to anything else that's happening at the same time seems to be connected in some way, and maybe it is. Maybe they're all interconnected to some extent. And I thought, I loved Coddling of the American Mind, Lukianoff and Haidt's book. But I always thought with that it was they identified I don't know, maybe something like 9 or something. It was a lot of different trends that they saw as leading to what they talked about as safetyism and that kind of culture. And there is it almost has too broad a focus. So I think there's definitely something there, and we mentioned in our book some of the stuff that Lukianoff and Haidt had talked about with how children are brought up. So it does make sense to me that if people are in environments where they're not don't have a lot of free time for play, so they're not getting used to managing conflicts with other people and those without adult supervision and those kinds of things, that can have something to do with a kind of, what we talked about as moral dependency, where you appeal to authorities very quickly to intervene in moral disputes. And so that all makes sense, and it's I think that's correct. I also am not sure, though, that there's more than one thing going on. The moral claims that are being made by activists are sometimes fit with that, because they talk about being traumatized, being harmed, and things like this. It's not always clear that they are. It's not always clear that the people making those claims are necessarily the people who are fragile or something in whatever sense Haidt and others are talking about it. They're often, they're activists, and so I do wonder sometimes, are they, do we want to separate, the moral claims and the morality people are making, which are often kind of independent of their personal reaction to these things. But I don't doubt that there's something, connected to the, to the therapeutic culture and all these things. I haven't read Haidt's new book yet, The Anxious Generation, but I want to read that soon. And I have followed the discourse and debate on it recently, and so I'm kind of interested. I know there's still some dispute. I see people arguing and Haidt responding and things like this about what exactly is happening. Is there a clear, rise in anxieties? Is it clearly connected to social media use? I think it probably is, but again, the evidence is what we need to look at the evidence on that thoroughly. And I think that with what we had talked about as victimhood culture, there was something to that too. We're not necessarily thinking about smartphones shaping people's upbringing, although that could be the case too. We had kind of talked about it, about technology, the internet and so on, in terms of like giving people the ability to connect with other people with the same grievances and to broadcast their grievances. So you see that kind of facilitating these kinds of moral claims, the publicizing of microaggressions and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and Haidt's been really great about interacting with people in an open environment in which he's willing to change his mind. Let's just see the data. Maybe we don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. that's how it's supposed to work. So kudos to him. To me, I think he's probably overplaying the screen time of social media, but it has to have some effect. I mean, just observationally, if you spend 8 hours a day on a screen and you're not interacting with other people in the analog world, that has to have some effect, even if it's not measurable on some sociological or psychological test. It's just the opportunity cost that he talks about. What are you not doing when you're 8 hours on a day on a screen? 8 hours in school, 8 hours in bed. That's it. That's all your time.
And it also,
So what's yeah.
yeah, I was just going to say, also makes sense to me. I know part of the argument seems to be that that it facilitates conflict. People can keep commenting on others and judging each other after school hours and so on, right? Because they're on these things, and so
Yeah.
you can see if you're never like escaping the these sorts of conflicts that you're in. So I think I think there's something to it, and I think whether it turns out to be completely correct or not, I mean, it seems like a good argument, and you're right. Haidt is a model of somebody who listens to critics and answers them, I think.
The other thing I have about it, though, after reading Abigail Shrier's book, Bad Therapy, is to what extent is it kind of a nocebo effect or a self-fulfilling effect where, say, normal teen angst growing up, relationships, the boyfriend broke up with me or the girlfriend dumped me, and so on. That's just sadness. Maybe you're anxious standing up in front of class to give a paper. That's all normal. I mean, you should feel anxious. That you're supposed to feel a little anxious. No one likes public speaking, right? But so her point is that if you kind of ruminate about it and cogitate and, well, okay, let's talk about your anxiety for the next hour. And then you start thinking, well, God, maybe I really do have a problem. Wow, I didn't know it was a thing. It's a diagnosis. Oh my gosh. I get a note from the doctor that says I don't have to do this in class. And then when the pollsters come around and say, do you feel depressed 3 times a day or whatever the measure is? Yes, that's me. And then so that's all in those numbers since 2015, that huge spike. I assume it's real in the sense that the kids saying I feel depressed, they really do. But is it in part it's kind of a nocebo effect because we're telling you you're supposed to feel that way? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I don't either. I know what Haidt's argument is that there's also a rise in suicide and self-harm, so it's not simply a more interpretation of things as anxiety or depression, that they actually seem to be more anxious and depressed. And I know that's maybe some of what people are arguing about.
Yeah.
The data.
And then the other thing regarding your previous work, I was thinking about on like safe spaces. So at Chapman University, they have safe spaces, of course. So I went to one of their safe space meetings. This was a LGBTQ safe space group, just to see what it was all about. And they were kind of talking about just shit people say to gays, right? So one of them, the gay guy, he said he was walking down the sidewalk, kind of in a residential area in Orange County, and I think they were holding hands or something, and somebody drove by and said something. Probably something like or something like this, right? And they were upset about this. Okay, yeah, well, there's just assholes out here. People yell at each other, whatever. You just blow it off, or maybe you don't blow it off, and maybe you shouldn't blow it off. So social justice, at some point, maybe it's good to bring this out and say, don't say that kind of stuff anymore. That is not cool. Rather than just saying, oh, well, there's assholes, and I'm just going to be tough about it. Again, I'm just riffing here. I don't know what the right answer is, but in terms of like social justice, how you start your book, well, I wrote this book, The Moral Arc, Martin Luther King, he's my hero. That's social justice. But what we're going through now is different than that. So let's start there. How do you think about social justice and what we should be offended about and do something about versus just buck up and put up with it?
Yeah, I mean, for things like this, and I think that's a good illustration that it's not, I mean, the attention to these things, I'm not arguing that it makes no sense or that it's crazy or that it's always wrong or something like that. And you can see why, even if you're talking about, you're talking about an incident like that, you might have another incident where somebody yells something stupid at you. And you can see why, if you're a minority of some sort, that would have a different effect on you getting the stuff yelled at. It comes in a more threatening
Yeah.
environment.
Yeah.
So they, again, a lot of this stuff makes sense. So with social justice, first of all, there's, I think a lot of people who are on the right or libertarians and so on really hate the term at all. But I'm more thinking of it in terms of there's justice at an individual level or right and wrong, but we all think there's some kind of, I mean, most of us would think that there's we want to organize a society in a particular way too. That doesn't mean there's a perfect right way to organize a society. It doesn't mean that we have all the answers, that we can perfect society. But there is something to trying to create social institutions that lead to human flourishing. And so if that's social justice, then I would think we should be pursuing social justice, and that we want some understanding of social science. We want through social science to be able to understand what the consequences of our actions would be. Does designing an institution this way work? Does this policy work? And it doesn't mean that it'll necessarily answer all those questions. But what I thought, and the reason I called it "How to Think Better About Social Justice," why good sociology matters, is that people didn't seem to even be thinking clearly about social justice. And talking about major policy changes and things like this without weighing cost and benefits, those sorts of things, or talking about things as if there would certainly be a solution to a particular problem, right? I mean, I don't think all problems have a solution. So those were some of the things that it just seems that if you are actually thinking scientifically about how the world works in a sociological way, that you're at least going to have to address those kinds of issues. What I see, though, is that, and particularly with critical theory, but I kind of try to emphasize and give other examples that, this critical social justice isn't the only offender. It's just that that recently, certainly since 2015 or something, it's sort of gone public that they, what people we'll call wokeism and all these things is derived from this critical theory perspective, critical social justice that was sort of before we all knew about it in universities for a long time but it sort of kind of spread out. And there is the claim from the activists that they're kind of drawing from this this important theoretical approach, right? That they think they have a well-grounded sociological approach that they're drawing from, and I think people who are simply watching all this stuff often assume that that's the case. And my argument was two things. First is that critical theory was only one perspective in sociology anyway. So if you're going to try to change the world based on some perspective, at least consider other ways that the world might work, right? And secondly, I thought, my argument is that critical theory has some big problems if you're going to use it to try to change the world for the better. And the biggest one is that it's anti-science. And I don't mean this as some kind of, I mean it, I'm critical of this, but I don't mean it simply as a criticism. This is what they say, that science, like other institutions, other kinds of norms, is part of a system of oppression. So it's not meant to be like a rival scientific theory along with other sociological theories. It's meant to stand back and critique the institutions of society. And what that ends up meaning is there's an idea that that the institutions of society are set up in a way that further oppression, and that that can be science, the government, and so on. And there's this hostility to science and also to liberalism broadly. The idea of the rule of law and free speech, equality before the law. These sorts of things are often attacked and critiqued by the theory. And what I argue is that what we need, if we're going to think better about social justice, we need to use good sociology instead of what I certainly see as bad sociology. We need scientific sociology, and that doesn't mean that there's always a clear answer. And I give examples, though, of different kinds of perspectives that you might use. There's outside of this view that society is made up of groups trying to dominate one another. There are other kinds of ways you might think of society, whether it's individuals making rational choices about their to try to further their goals, what we call rational choice theory in sociology. There is functionalism, where we see the institutions kind of working together in harmony, and many more kinds of sociological perspectives. And so I thought that if we're going to pursue social justice, we need to use good sociology, and bad sociology is likely just to make things worse. And that means we are making, often critical theory ends up being more of an ideology than a scientific theory.
Is there a division in sociology along the lines of what there was in anthropology during the anthropology wars of the 1990s, largely between the biological anthropologists and the cultural anthropologists, largely turning on to what extent you think human nature is a blank slate versus, genetic programs and so on? Does sociology have something like that going on?
I would say it has. It has something like that. And I mean, it has that. I mean, there's that kind of debate going on about evolution and how much our biology affects behavior. But I would say, unfortunately, that is probably even such a small perspective. Sociologists tend to simply ignore biological factors and stuff. Where there is a debate, and there has been for a long time, is there's a debate or sort of a division between what you would think of as, well, I would say scientific. They say positivist sociology, which is usually used derogatorily. It doesn't have to be, right, but it's but the more kind of the idea that sociology would be a science like the natural sciences. That doesn't mean it's identical, but its aims are the same. We're trying to describe and explain the world, is what they call the positivistic approach, or this, that's the more scientific kind of sociology. There's then the critical sociology, which is the more activist kind of idea that you're trying to change the world, and sort of in between humanistic sociology, where the aims aren't necessarily scientific, but they're not anti-scientific. And I like a lot of what they call the humanistic approach too, because it's often historical and things like that, or you're trying to understand stuff. So you have that kind of division that's long been there in sociology. And that was one of the reasons I always thought, well, why are we suddenly now taking this critical approach as the way of changing the world? It's in recent years, I would say, though, the critical approach has become, if not dominant it's not that it's dominant in the top journals, but at the level of many departments, and then also the American Sociological Association. It sort of seems to dominate. It's kind of energizes graduate students and things like this. So it's become, I mean, the conferences of the American Sociological Association now, virtually always have some kind of activist orientation, and often drawn from critical theory. The conference this year is called, the theme is intersectional solidarities, building communities of hope, justice, and joy. So this is the kind of thing you'll have now, and we haven't. I mean, seldom have. I think in 2011, Randall Collins was the president of the American Sociological Association, and that year the theme was conflict. It was about how to understand conflict, and it was great. It was the probably my favorite. Probably the last time I saw a good presidential address at an American Sociological Association event. But no more. There's never. It's never kind of a subject matter that we need to explain. It's how do we make the world better. And as with the intersectional thing, it tends to be critical theory oriented.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe the division is between what the goals of sociological science are: truth finding or changing the world, social justice. But it seems to me those go together. If you want to know how to make the world a better place, or you have to understand why groups are different in the first place. Let me just think about this out loud for a moment. Why are there black and white differences in annual income, generational wealth, home ownership? These things that we've heard a lot about since the Black Lives Matter movement, especially came online, and Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and so on point these things out. Why are they there? I mean, it's one thing to say, well, they shouldn't be there. Okay, I agree. Yeah, what can we do? But why are they there? Because if you don't know why, then what are you going to do about it? So if it's, well, the government needs to have different tax policies, or some incentive programs, if you're going to use like a behavioral choice model or something like that, or maybe it's the institutions themselves need more DEI, something like that. How do you know which programs are going to work, and how do you decide what the problem is to be solved? And there, it seems to me, it turns on this question of equity versus equality. Is it equality of opportunity or equality of outcomes? And as you know, people like Ibram X. Kendi basically say, unless it's perfectly equal across the board, 13%, 14% African American, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, representatives in Congress, senators, whatever the industry is or the profession, until it hits that mark, then we have racism and we have a problem. But that's a different goal than equality of opportunity, in which you want to remove as many barriers to people as you can. And it seems to me that that's all confused here in this issue.
And that's I agree certainly that and that's what my book is about, that there shouldn't, to have a field even divided in a particular way, where one side has an activist orientation and then the other is a scientific. It makes no sense, and that if you again there's other activists can be outside of sociology. The point of sociology is to be the science of social life, and it certainly, if you're concerned about changing the world, and you're going to want a science of social life. You need that to do social justice. And so what I'm saying is when you have a theoretical approach that acts more like an ideology, that it's not putting forth propositions to be tested and kind of scrutinizing things, thinking, well, how would we measure this, and what would alternate hypotheses look like? How might you test them? These are the questions we should be asking about all these claims, but they're not really put forward as scientific claims. They're put forward as knowledge about the world, and it when I say it's ideological, I don't mean that there are no claims about the social world. There are, but they're not always put forward as claims to be tested, and there's sort of a mix of activist and scientific ideas there. So I've just said, you should take these claims, whether it's from Kendi or someone else, or the concepts themselves. Think about, what if they're saying something about the world, something observable about the social world. What is that? Like, can we specify that and measure it? And so and that's a good example with Kendi's idea is that any racial disparity is simply racism, right? It's simply the result of institutional racism, and that's a claim to be tested, not in any particular case why the disparity exists. It's not something that can sort of just be known in advance. And so that's the kind of what I think of as bad sociological thinking that is dominating social justice discourse. It's not it people aren't trying to understand the world first before they're changing it. And and this is what's important. What I want to emphasize is that if you do that, if you act on things that aren't true, then you're not likely to change the world for the better. And I think that's a lot of what's happening. And some of these things, as they do get implemented into policy, are likely to have negative effects and to harm the people they're supposed to help.
Yeah. One of these books I just read, Meta Racism, it's called, where the author bailed on me at the last minute. But she made some really good points I wanted to talk to her about. For example, even though, redlining is disallowed and, most of the legal hurdles against African Americans have been lifted, there's still a lot of subtle ones. For example, the zip code system of public education has kind of set up this, sliding scale where, the better the neighborhood you're in, the more expensive the home, the bigger the tax base, the better the school gets because it has more money. And therefore, more people move to those neighborhoods, which drives the price of the homes up, which increases the tax bases for the school that gets even better. And then the opposite happens in the poor communities. So, if that's true, and I think it probably is, well, then maybe the government could do something about that. Maybe we abandon the zip code model of public education and we try something different. That would be an example of that where sociologists could test that hypothesis and then make recommendations for policy.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of things where the claim that that institutions are set up in a way that disadvantages particular groups of people is likely to be correct. But and so it's not that can't ever be. And then one way to address it would be to redesign those. Even then, you want to know, what are the effects of the correction going to be, those sorts of things. But I think those issues need to be investigated, and that's a good example of a place where there's a role for if you're pursuing social justice to try to do something there that will address these disparities people are talking about. But we have to understand understand the causes.
Another one she had was she was talking about the Trayvon Martin case, and that he the right kind of paraded out his track record as a truant student and all the trouble he got into and so on in school. But in fact, she shows with data that black kids in these public schools, when they missed class, the punishment was harsher than for the white kids who missed school, who were truant or whatever, for the same number of times. They got like twice the punishment that the white kids got. Whoa, okay. If that's true, why is that happening? Who's doing this? Why? What school policies are letting this happen? That should be corrected.
Yeah, and I think one example I gave maybe in the rise of victimhood culture that I kind of reading the work of Peter Amaskos, who's a criminologist who studies the police, but he had noted just that there are differences in there are big differences in the rates of killing by police, like at different police departments, different states, different cities, these kinds of things. So one of the things that needs investigation is what's happening. Is it something about the police training? Something, but you could presumably do something to reduce killings by police officers if you investigate it. But you have to investigate and see what the causes are. What are the differences between these kinds of departments? And as he pointed out, nobody seems to be interested in doing that. Right? Like they're not. If the problem is simply conceived of as a society-wide problem, rather than looking for variation and trying to use that as a basis of understanding it, then we're likely to not make progress.
Another thing I was thinking about reading your book in current events was Harvard and Caltech reinstituting standardized tests, namely the SAT and the ACT as entrance criteria. Why did they remove them in the first place? Well, that was kind of a social justice move. There are racial group differences in outcomes of these standardized tests. Everybody knows what the Asians at the top, whites in the middle, blacks bottom. And that just seemed unfair to do that. And then the argument was made, I guess recently, that, well, but in fact, they help pluck out some of these really talented kids in these underserved, underprivileged communities to give them an opportunity. So it seemed that would be an area where science could say something about the way it really is. I mean, before we make an ought statement, we ought to get rid of the SATs or we ought to keep the SATs. Well, we need to know what is the real effect of them in the first place. And that there you have that is ought, I think, where it's blurred in there. But maybe here, pulling from your book here, definition of classical liberalism, you quote Francis Fukuyama. A range of political views that nonetheless agree on the foundational importance of equal individual rights, law, and freedom. So maybe this turns on what's the target we're looking to change. Is it the group or is it the individual? Because these standardized tests, then what they're telling us is that we can find some of those talented young students in these underserved communities and send them to Harvard, send them to Caltech. They'll really have a great opportunity. But that's the individual argument. That doesn't help the group necessarily, right? So maybe a group argument. So maybe this whole debate turns on classical liberalism versus whatever else it would be.
Yeah, I mean, one of the what I see as the main problem, if I'm trying to just understand how we can think clearly and sociologically about these issues, the problem I have with critical social justice, the use of critical theory here, is that it, again, they kind of by seeing science as part of one of the tools of oppression, they abandon then the tool that we have to understanding better these consequences and stuff. But the practical thing that I have, that's more conceptual. The big practical problem I have is that critical theory, and I don't know if everybody always understands this, is mainly an attack on liberalism. It's intended to be an attack on liberal institutions, liberal in the broad historical sense, seeing those as discriminatory, as oppressive, and so this has a long history and kind of that's what Marxism did in a different way too, right? And there's lots of there's feminist theory, certain feminist theories of law, Catherine McKinnon, and so on. This goes way back and has different forms, but it's what they see as the source of injustice is liberalism, and in the broad sense that Fukuyama talks about liberalism, and so I don't, by classical liberalism, I'm not talking about libertarianism, which is how people use it, although that fits in that category. But I don't see that we have any reason, certainly not automatically, to make liberalism the enemy and abandon it. If we're kind of approaching these things about trying to figure out how the world works and how institutions work, I think there's a lot of evidence that liberal institutions achieve the goals that social justice advocates say are their goals, that they go farther in achieving those than other kinds of societies. So, whether that, and so we don't need to, in that view, whether we, whether free speech protections are producing oppression, or whether equality before the law is, or something like that. That's something that needs to be investigated, but also it should be comparative. And I think part of the problem is often that if something bad happens within a liberal society, there's the idea of connecting it to that, right? Rather than let's compare societies or compare different social contexts and really try to sort that out. No society is going to be free of conflict or free of injustice and those sorts of things. So if you may, if I didn't fully address, you had gone out a bit, and I couldn't hear part of what you were saying before. So I could return to that. But I do think it's not that my argument is necessarily that classical liberalism is the best possible society or only possible society ever. I mean, the world changes, technology changes, we may get something very different in the far future. But I don't see any alternatives now that would actually be able, like, provide a framework for achieving social justice goals that would involve protecting minorities, that would involve pluralism, and not that's minority groups, people who think different ways, want to live different ways, that would give us a mechanism for trying to sort out our differences, for treating people with respect, for and for trying to make the world better, even though we know we can't make it perfect.
Yeah. Another way to think about it, I think classical liberalism probably applies mostly to people near the center, left of center, and right of center. So, as you point out in your book, some conservatives are classical liberals, even though they hate that word liberals. But maybe to the left of classical liberals are progressives who might then say, well, individual rights, yeah, that's all fine and good, but what about the group? Group differences make a difference. And if you go to the right, populism, economic nationalism, this whole, we're going to make America great again. And Trump's economic policies are not classical liberal. This isn't Adam Smith. This isn't Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and so on. This is mercantilism. This is win-loss, zero sum. If the Chinese get ahead, then we're getting behind, right? That's not economic liberalism and individualism either. We're going to tax electric cars coming into America. Oh, great. To double the cost of, goods that we could benefit from. Adam Smith debunked this, in 1776. I mean, come on. But maybe that's a difference between what your overall goal is, the individual freedom, autonomy, and liberty versus the group.
Yeah. And I agree that basically that if you're going far to the right or far to the left, then you're moving away from this. Although it's still, I mean, you can still have a liberal society where that may be illiberal, so to speak, on some points, right? It's not. I mean, I think it's you can. There's a pretty broad range of still having the same kinds of institutions, even if you have on the left, you're going to, or as you pointed out, some now on the right too, but you're going to restrict, you're going to have more restrictions on economic behavior, or redistribution of wealth, and those sorts of things. On the right, maybe the right's more likely to place emphasis on law and order, and be more likely to maybe to violate individual rights and in terms of trying to keep social order. That's been typically the case. So, I think, those kinds of disagreements are still somewhat within the norm of liberal societies. And what you've also had on the right these kind of just sort of overt attacks on liberalism. Patrick Deneen, these other people who have kind of who have written that liberalism has failed, right? So why liberalism has failed was the Deneen book, and I think that's the right wing version of this that you get on the left from the critical social justice people, that whatever the bad things we see here, liberalism is the cause of that, and I think both are wrong. I don't see anybody actually. One thing, they don't really propose alternatives to the that would make that would seem to achieve their goals without causing widespread harm. But I agree. It's definitely an issue with the left and the right when you get toward more of a group-oriented view than an individualistic view. That's kind of where you're moving sort of toward more illiberalism.
Yeah, and another issue that you discussed, Thomas Sowell's visions, unconstrained vision versus constrained vision, left and right. Um, but their science can at least inform us that one of these worldviews is more accurate than the other one. So if one political orientation, let's say progressives, embrace this unconstrained worldview that we can make the world a utopia where everybody is successful. It isn't that way. Why not? Because of the systemic injustices that have to be combated against. Okay, off we go to the races with activism. But if you're constrained, then you go, well, it's never going to be perfect. It's just, we're not going to have utopia. We could just try to do what I love Kevin Kelly's term, protopia, just make tomorrow slightly better than today. Don't ever aim for utopia because bad things happen when you do that, right? So there, at least I think, in that is-ought question, science can inform us, well, which worldview is better, more accurate than the other one?
Yeah, I think that's correct, and I always in using science to inform morality, I think it always has to do with where you're starting from. If you have some kind of moral ideals you're trying to realize, what science is telling you is how possible that is, and that's part of what if we're looking at how the social world works, then there's certain kind of constraints on what we can do, and that's the Thomas Sowell's constrained vision, and it's again, it's not that the world can't be improved. As you said, you could make it better tomorrow than it was yesterday. It's that it can never be perfected. You can never eliminate conflict. You could never eliminate some sort of injustice. And you have something like Marxism, which really is very explicitly utopian in the sense that there's supposed to be a new kind of society after the revolution eventually. And I think most people can see that it's not just that was sort of just a weird thing that never happened, right? It's sort of like that was a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of Marx about how social life, how societies work. It was almost wishful thinking. I think even Marx's theory, even taking the basic ideas, which I don't agree with, but in full, but just the idea that class struggle is producing historical change, and one kind of society then leads to another kind of society with a new class struggle. The idea that rather than that it would make sense to say that would keep happening. And Marx's idea was that instead, after capitalism, you get this new kind of society entirely, and each person, gives according to their ability and takes according to their need, and there's human nature is altered, but is completely different because it was what we called human nature was always about the class system. That stuff that's utopian thinking, and it never really should have even never made sense to anybody at the time, and it's certainly not good sociological thinking. So if we can't have utopia, then that should give us some caution when we go to try to change the world. We've seen kind of the disasters that people have produced in searching for utopia, and I know you've written about that, and I like your work on that. The Heavens on Earth book, and you talked a lot about that. So that's that's something we need to caution against. I also said that even people who most people would acknowledge that there can't be a utopia, I think, and know that there's almost whether you have this explicit utopianism or not, it almost feels like there's an implicit utopian in a lot of thinking, though, because people will talk about things as if a problem is certainly correctable, right? Like if something that exists shouldn't exist anymore, right? Whether it's like say it's inequality, and is every form of inequality simply something we should be trying to eliminate? I mean that it doesn't seem possible to have a large complex society without inequality, and if that's the case, is that even what we're aiming for? There's no point in aiming for something that's not possible. Or you get even smaller scale things where, um, I mentioned in the book, the police abolition movement. It became popular even among more mainstream people to talk about defunding or even abolishing the police in the last few years. And this is, if you want to make that argument, you need you need to make the argument about how you're then going to do all the things that police do. Why won't violence go up? All these sorts of things. But the idea is that if you've identified some problem that the police are producing, you must be able to just eliminate that, right? And it seems to me, I want to make, I'd like to see police departments become better. And I mentioned that, if you one thing to do is compare them and see which are doing better, try to implement the same things. But I don't think there's not going to be a society anytime soon where you have police trying to control crime and so on, and the police also never do anything unjust or illegal. I mean, you end up having to deal with those things through law and stuff, but it's not that those things you're not going to get a system where that never happens, right? And that's what I mean by this more small scale utopian thinking, to assume that a problem can simply be eliminated, and maybe some can, but I think a lot of problems are sort of in the nature of things. It's trade-offs
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
sort.
Attenuate, not eliminate, because there's always going to be a few racist assholes out there or whatever in any field, including the police. So just deal with those. That guy right there. This was my argument, but it's not the problem. Is not the police. It's that guy right there. Derek Chauvin. Use him as a target. That's the guy. He's the problem. Get rid of him. Get him off the street. Right. But again, that's part of that kind of collective on average thinking versus individual thinking. Maybe that's the difference there. Talk for a minute about the protesters that we've seen in recent years. These kids throwing bricks through the Bank of America or starting a fire in the Starbucks, or the climate activists that are lying down in the road or throwing soup on a painting. I gather they're passionate and they believe what they say. They think this is going to make a difference. What do you think is going on in their head? Do they think this through, like this is going to be our strategy and then the next thing's going to happen and we're going to get the change we want? Or how does that work, do you think?
No, I don't think they think it through, but I think that they should. And
Yeah.
I want to encourage people to think about the actual real world, the real world that scientific sociologists study, and try to to think about, if you have goals, you want to change the world. What it was doing this action likely to lead to this, and I think, if you start to analyze these things, um, what forms of protest are likely to lead to success and which aren't. That would be one thing I would want to know if I were an activist, and people don't. It's not even just that people don't seem to be interested in the question. They often attack people who say their tactics are ineffective. Right? They don't show that they're effective. Right? Like by pointing to research or something. People are simply attacked as if you should simply, always support people whose cause is right.
One explanation I heard, I don't know if this is true or not, but that by acting completely crazy, doing these totally irrational things as protesters, then you come back from that and just ask for a little small change in the law. That doesn't seem so bad. You're more likely to get it. I won't throw soup on the paintings anymore if you'll just make this little change about carbon sequestration in some industrial plant, something like that.
Yeah, that doesn't. Yeah, I can't see that actually happening in those circumstances. I mean, there must be examples of that if you have enough, um, if the groups are large enough and powerful enough, right, that is sometimes people get part of what they want. But I don't know that, yeah, throwing paint on paintings is an example of that, right? That it's more,
Okay,
yeah, yeah. I mean, I could see
let's talk
where
about
I was just going to say
yeah,
I could see where it
yeah.
applies to something like, a situation like, Gaza and Israel or something where, you know, making an advance, even if people condemn your action, they may end up giving you something to keep peace. But yeah, I don't. If you're an activist throwing paint on a painting, then you're in a weak position.
Nellie Bowles had a great story from her coverage of the autonomous zone in Seattle. What was it called? CHAZ, I think it was called, where one of the shopkeepers was in favor of abolishing the police. And so the police, they left that whole area. And then there was crime and shoplifting and violence and all that stuff. And then after the whole thing ended, she sued the city for not providing the police, even though in the lawsuit she says, I still support defunding the police. However, the city owed it to me to send the police. It was hilarious.
Yes, and that, I mean, things like that. I always try to take people at face value about what they believe, and not always think there are other kinds of motives and stuff. And I think people are usually trying to be sincere at the moment, right? But yeah, that would call into question, how sincere are people about about some of these beliefs? Are they attention getters, or do they really want no police? That's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
hard to understand. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's a stand-in or proxy for something else that they believe. I don't trust authorities. We have to be cautious. The police are an authority. Maybe it's something like that. All right, let's talk about culture, multiculturalism, identity and identity politics. These are areas that sociologists study. Kind of help us walk us through what all this means, multiculturalism and identity politics.
Um, I think, I mean, what we think of I mean, there are different kinds of identity politics. So I think that the critical social justice form is kind of dividing the world into oppressed groups and oppressors, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the kind of this dominant social justice framework that we've been getting. Identity politics can also simply be, different groups of people within a pluralistic society pursuing their interest, pursuing justice, and I think, you know the latter kind, doesn't have to be the former, right? You don't have to see um, oppressed and oppressors in every kind of situation. You could also simply see, there's a lot of different groups in society. It makes sense for them to mobilize and to have a voice. And I think, the part of the problem I have with some of this, with some of the approaches of the critical social justice activists, is that while they do focus on certain kinds of diversity or pluralism, others, that they kind of ignore. So if you actually have a pluralistic society where you have people of different ethnicities and different religions and people, coming from different places, you're also going to have some pluralism in beliefs and values, and and you're not going to be able to kind of get everybody to agree with you. And this gets into the, it's similar, to the utopianism of some of the social justice activism, and thinking we can just have a perfect kind of world with no conflict. But here it's also that other people in a pluralistic society, there are always people who disagree with you, and you need to be able to create institutions that allow for that and manage that disagreement. And that doesn't mean, that you never, everybody can't get their way. And so it's not So if we actually value pluralism, we're not going to have everybody's not going to agree on critical social justice either, and so it can't become the dominant way of I mean, it's taken over trainings and diversity trainings in corporations and at schools and all sorts of things. And I think that's one example of this kind of thinking where um, there's a lot of talk about diversity, but they are are pursuing a kind of conformity, at least in the realm of values. And then again, getting to that, with liberalism, what free speech and those sorts of things do is give space to people to disagree. And I think if you're going to pursue social justice, you might also think about how to foster pluralism. And I'm not sure that identity politics in that former sense, the critical social justice sense, where people are either oppressors or oppressed and their actions are evaluated that way. I don't think that does that.
Yeah. Make the case against free speech like you do in the book. That is to say, it's easy for you, a middle class white guy professor, to say I believe in free speech because guess what? I have a lot of free speech, but oppressed peoples don't have that same kind of freedom. Why should they? Is it something like that? That's the argument, but I'm not making it very well.
Yes, it's the idea is that is that free speech. What people call free speech is simply to amplify the voices of the powerful, or something like that. So and it's so you what you need is, and it's similar to a lot of these arguments that are sort of anti individual rights in the old liberal sense, right? They're saying that those things are fostering oppression. It's really all these arguments have a similar kind of form to what Marx talked about with the wage labor contracts, right? So the idea is that even if it's an agreed upon contract, a person is agreeing to work for wages, the person is actually being exploited, and so that this kind of equality then, because it's an equality between people who aren't equals, that it enables the powerful to exploit the powerless. So people kind of extended that idea, but because they're not strict Marxists or anything, into all these other kinds of situations. So whether it means that treating men and women equally before the law gives men an advantage. That was Catherine McKennan's argument. Or and then what I've seen more recently is the free speech thing, that free speech is sort of amplifying the voices of the powerful. Now, I think that's incorrect, so I give the best.
But what? Okay, go ahead. Tell us what's wrong with it. Yeah, what's wrong with that argument?
To me, it's on its face wrong, because those if the government is stepping in to censor speech, then it's not censoring the speech of the powerful, right? That you're sort of by definition not not powerful. So it's always going to be, the government. If the government's involved in policing speech, it's policing speech it doesn't like, right? It's so, and I don't, you know, I actually, just for basic moral reasons, I think people should simply be able to say what they think, but it also acts as a kind of truce. I mean, that's what free speech really is just sort of, we're all going to lay down our arms in a sense here, and we won't try to censor each other because there's sort of no end to it. We're all, if we're censoring speech, we're all just trying to grab the levers of power at some point and censor the other side. The starting point, though, is it's actually pretty easy to understand why people are against free speech if you just think of, what causes harm in the world. If it's bad ideas, then the obvious answer is to censor those bad ideas, and that has a long history. I think we've learned something, and that free speech was an advance on that, and I don't think we should abandon it. But it's sort of easy to see why people would simply say, well, if this is causing harm, and I think it is, then censor it.
Yeah, I think along the lines of hate speech, there's very few things I think the government should be censoring. Obviously, giving the nuclear codes to the enemy is, something like that, and lying about medicines, and I don't know, things that could actually harm people. But the bar has to be pretty high. I don't even think Trump's speech on January 6th rises to the level of inciting violence, although I guess some people could claim that they do. But the First Amendment experts I've talked to said they don't think it reaches that level. But that's more of a collective thing. What we don't want the government to do that, but what should you personally do, or your company? It's like the pronoun thing. I can't stand these pronouns, but I'm in the publishing business. Every email I get from editors and so on, they all have the pronouns, and every academic I email with, they all have the pronouns. I just think it's ridiculous. I just think it's virtue signaling and so on. But if you personally said, Michael, I'd like you to call me this or use this pronoun, of course I would. I don't want to be a dick. So I guess maybe there's, public policy versus private behavior or action, or like the progressive stack, which is just a hilarious idea. Again, this free speech. Well, but some people are less inclined to raise their hand in class, so we're going to call on first the people of color, and then the last person we're going to call on in class is the white guy. Something like that, trying to, I guess, right wrongs of the past in a little tiny way. And I also think that's ridiculous. But on the other hand, I've been a professor for a long time, decades. And I do notice that the men are more aggressive than the women about getting their hands up. And they jump in faster for discussions. And so I kind of unconsciously, I kind of scan, and after the first, second, or third, I just skip the guys until finally a woman raised, okay, you. I do that. It's like, okay, am I subject to this? But that's a personal thing, not an institutional policy. I don't know. How do you think about all that?
Yeah, I think, well, I do think, just as I wouldn't, I wouldn't censor speech. Also, we've talked about microaggressions and things like this. I don't necessarily think that, and this is an argument that Haidt and Lukyanov has made too, that it's actually harmful to encourage people to be overly sensitive to slight, to kind of be scanning for offenses. I also don't think people should be offensive, though. I mean, I think you should
right.
respect people. This is also part of of kind of treating people with dignity, and that you want to look at the good intentions of people. But so there's a lot of there's a lot of incivility in politics elsewhere in society that I think isn't good. I don't think the government can do a whole lot to help that. But on the idea of just, as you see, like, you're kind of grappling with, what do we do about some things that that do seem to be actual problems, and maybe the solutions aren't the right ones. And one thing we could do is simply you're letting people form their own communities how they want. People could, somebody could try to implement these ideas, like try to create a space for people to implement those. You could call it a safe space, right? But the idea would be that you're developing this kind of community to show that it works, and that would be one thing that we could then analyze, right? Because those who are critical of critical social justice tend to think that that the ideas, when they're implemented, cause more harm than good, that they cause more conflict, and all this. So if that's not the case, demonstrate it in community. I mean, that would be one way. One of the things I talked about was these utopian communities of the 19th century, where they they had the idea everybody was just going to copy them, and it would flourish around the world. And that's some confidence in your in your in your idea. Utopianism, as we've talked about, um, is is isn't great, but especially because they did it voluntarily, they weren't causing as much harm as trying to reorganize the whole society. And if they had been, if you are effective then and creating kind of community that people want to live in, maybe people will copy it. So it doesn't have to be a utopian community, but just trying to create a community based on your own kinds of values without compelling people to do something would be something I would suggest. And then we can get more evidence about what does reduce conflict, what does produce more equality, and all these sorts of things.
And where do you put DEI in that package? Is it a good idea, a bad idea, a good experiment, but run its course? How do you think about it?
I mean, I think what is called DEI at universities and things like that tends to be very heavily informed by critical social justice ideas, and I don't think it's good. That doesn't mean I would reject whole scale the idea of having any, you know, I don't reject civil rights law, those sorts of things. So, I mean, I think there's a place, at a university, at a corporation, and those kinds of things um, for some kind of um, institutional effort to enforce the law and those sorts of things. But I don't think certainly the way it's being implemented in lots of places is causing a lot of harm. And what I mentioned earlier, just universities increasingly requiring DEI statements for applicants, or for people applying for jobs. And what it's at the University of California, this wasn't simply some perfunctory thing. They were they were eliminating large numbers of applicants based on their DEI statements, and they were really asking people to demonstrate a commitment to this particular ideology. And I think that doesn't have any place at a public university in the first place, to be screening people for this kind of very it's at best it's screening people for left-wing political views, and probably something even further to the extreme than that. And I think that's a violation of rights. But I also think that it's it's very counterproductive, in the sense that you want people who are at a university who are pursuing their subjects and excelling in that, and to kind of eliminate them for a lack of participation in DEI activities is potentially eliminating lots of good scholars, also getting a kind of uniformity of thought on campus. So I think that, yeah, most of these, or I would say many, because I don't know exactly, the proportion in terms of everything that a DEI department does. I'm sure I agree with a lot of it, but what's happened in recent years is that more and more of the critical social justice ideas have been implemented, and I think that's usually counterproductive.
Yeah. Yeah, here again, I think distinction between public and private. Like, I just gave a talk here at Westmont College in Santa Barbara. It's a Christian college. And, I like the students, and some of the professors came, and I thought, hey, I wonder if they'd be interested in my teaching and having me teach my critical thinking class, Skepticism 101. And then one of the students said, well, actually, the professors have to sign a statement that they believe that Jesus is the Savior and so on. I went, oh, well, okay. Fair enough. That's what they're selling, right? That's their thing. You go there to get a good Christian education. Fine. But that's different than a public university that really should not be doing that sort of thing. But that is, in fact, what these DEI programs are doing. In a way, it's like a religion in which you have to sign a statement of your adherence to these doctrines that otherwise you shouldn't be here. Something like that.
Yeah, it doesn't have any place in a public university. Even a private university could do it the way that Christian schools do and be explicit about it, but they don't. I mean, normally they claim that, a commitment to diversity of ideas and opinions, to science, and those sorts of things. And so, yeah, if they people want to establish, and call it progressive university or something, and let people come there, let them do that, but not certainly not public universities. And then, you know, then you'd also, I don't think it would be good for the universities, but I do respect people's freedom to create the kinds of institutions they want to.
Yeah. Well, again, for real social justice, I think you have to have a commitment to truth because you got to know what actually works. And that's where, science comes in. We have to have that pluralistic, open, free speech environment, or else we're never going to get to the truth because you have a whole chapter on this. We're flawed. We're fallible. We're not omniscient. And therefore we have to have that openness to testing ideas and that you could be wrong. And this is the problem with religion, but also the religion of woke ideology, whatever the right term is, call it social justice ideology, something like that. Is that you already have the answer. So I don't really need to talk to people that don't agree with me. I think that's been my problem trying to get people to talk to me. I think why do we need to talk to this guy? He's going to ask me questions that I don't think are legitimate, something like that. I don't know. So, one of the people I follow, Chris Rufo, he's been pretty active against DEI, critical race theory. I'm a little conflicted about this, using the power of the state to go after Disney, for example, or the power of the government to go into universities and say, it's one thing to say, we don't like what you're doing, or we're not sure it works. Someone like you saying, I'm not sure this is going to work. But for the government to say, you can't do this anymore, we're outlawing it. I don't know. I'm conflicted about that. How do you think about it?
I think it depends on the specific issue, and I certainly think there's a role for the government to require public universities to protect free speech rights, for example. So those sorts of things. Now, that doesn't mean I always, then the other issue is whether you trust the people in power to handle it effectively. And then the other thing is the curriculum. I don't think it's the best way to go about trying to change these things, to have the government coming in and trying to change the curriculum or something. On the other hand, it's to be expected. So I always was kind of amazed as a sociologist since I was in graduate school that there were people who were so explicitly left-wing activists. I mean, this is how they define themselves, and they wanted the discipline to be this way, and some extent is. And whether it's, there's sociology, but then the broader university. If you define your mission as progressive politics of some kind, it doesn't make sense to then expect conservative legislatures to keep supporting you. So just as a practical matter, what were they thinking? Is something I might ask. And I was so again, it's not about whether they should intervene, but it's entirely predictable that they eventually would. I always was kind of surprised by it. I thought, well, people are so activist and so on, but then all these conservative states that they aren't messing with them too much, and then they started messing with them. So it's not. It eventually happened, and even the discipline of sociology recently in the state of Florida, they took sociology had been one of the it filled one of the requirements for the general education curriculum at Florida's university, and the state removed that. And the Florida's Commissioner of Education said in the course of them doing this that sociology had been hijacked by left-wing activists. Now, that's I'm in sociology. To some extent, it's been hijacked by left-wing activists, but the American Sociological Association, though, said put out a statement, against this action by Florida, and said it was that they were that it came from a misunderstanding. This quote: misunderstanding of sociology as an illegitimate discipline driven by radical and woke ideology. And so then they said that in fact sociology is the scientific study of social life, social change, and the social causes and consequences of human behavior. Now, that sounds great to me. It's a scientific, it's a scientific study of social life. That's what I think sociology is. But that's what I've been saying for years, and the people, who run the American Sociological Association have been saying something different. And even this year, I mentioned that conference, that the conference is called Intersectional Solidarities, and it actually says in there on the website explaining the theme, it says it emphasizes sociology as a form of liberatory praxis, an effort to not only understand structural inequalities, but to intervene in socio-political struggles. So they're saying this is what sociology is. It's liberatory praxis, and we're intervening in in political struggles. And then the state of Florida takes sociology off the curriculum, and they say, "Oh, sociology is a science." What do you think? What do you think we're activists? This is completely, so this is like this double talk. You're saying one thing to one audience and one to another. So it's not. I mean, I don't want sociology taken off the curriculum and that sort of thing too. But I think we have to be a serious science if we're going to have, if we're going to be able to have some kind of, legitimacy in telling the state legislature they shouldn't do that, right? Like, if we're simply, if we're simply left-wing activists, why would conservative legislatures want us on the curriculum? So, I don't support all of what's happening. I also don't know what to do about it as long as this is what's going on, right? So people are going to fight back in some ways. I'm not going to agree with that, with the way they're fighting back all the time. And it's not like, I'm not doing what Rufo's doing. But my guess is that if I analyzed all his actions, some of them are probably, worth doing, and some of it probably not. I know he's coming from much more right-wing position than I would.
Yeah, one of the arguments was that DEI policies actually violate the Civil Rights 1964 laws by discriminating against people based on their race and religion and so on. So I think that's how I think Texas banned DEI in all public universities now. I think that just got implemented this month. And I think the argument was something like that. Okay, well, what about viewpoint diversity? To me, that's what's needed, right? So one of my opening lectures in my class is to show those graphs, those pie charts of conservatives versus liberals versus far left, far right on university campuses. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny little sliver of the conservatives in the social sciences. Basically, I tell them, you have next to no chance of getting any perspective of what conservatives actually believe when you're here at the university. You're just not. You're just not going to get it. You're going to have to ask for it or read on your own or push back or something like that. It's just the way it is. And, it's not, but I don't want the state to come in and say, you have to hire some conservatives or you have to have Sean Hannity come give a guest lecture or something like that. But, it seems to me if we're going to push for diversity, it would be viewpoint diversity more than anything else.
Yeah, I agree that the viewpoint diversity is needed. And that was, when Jonathan Haidt started Heterodox Academy, that was their main goal, that campuses were not diverse enough with viewpoints, and that was interesting that they had actually started that before a lot of the stuff started happening with college campuses, and it wasn't so much based on that people were being censored and speeches being shut down. It was just this lopsidedness in the disciplines where I saw something. I'm never sure exactly about the numbers, and they change, but it's something like I think 1 out of 44 sociologists identifies as a conservative or something. I saw that recently. So it's very very small in sociology. Different fields are somewhat different, but but certainly in the social sciences, people are overwhelmingly progressive. I think something like 25% of sociologists identify as Marxists. So you're not going to get a viewpoint diversity. And this is why censoring speech is so bad, because at least if you're not going to be exposed to ideas as much in a university, at least you give the ability to conservative groups or whoever to bring in speakers if people want to hear them, right? People should be able to hear that and be exposed to it. But I don't know exactly what to do about the viewpoint diversity problem. I know Heterodox Academy tried to some extent to address this, but yeah, it probably wouldn't be a good idea to try to start doing quotas or something. You don't want to, like, oh, you have to hire this many Republicans or this many Democrats. So, um, and one of the things Haidt had pointed out when they started Heterodox Academy is that this was always the campuses were always liberal, and certainly sociology, was heavily progressive and so on. It's just that it has gotten so much more so that as long as you had kind of a certain number of people around who would give the opposing viewpoint, things worked better. Even though for various reasons, self-selection and so on, people tended to be more liberal. But now you almost have no opposing voices, and the people. What's happened then is that people um, who are on the left get called conservatives, right? Because you're shifting, and I wonder if some of them um, are lamenting driving away all the conservatives so that now they're the conservatives.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people like Stephen Pinker, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, these are people I know that are just right down the barrel liberal, old school liberal. And they're now, right wing, they're doors to the right wing, or they are right wing. It's just like, what? Did this happen? As a sign of the times, right? Was that?
Yeah. Everybody else is gone from the university.
Yeah,
So
that's right. Yeah.
you're on
As
the right.
we age out, I guess. Well, okay. Last question. Do you see the ship is turning, the tide is turning? Are we at that point where things are going to get pushed back enough? We'll get back to the more balanced condition on these social justice issues.
I don't know. You mentioned earlier the reinstatement of the SATs, which actually should be that's some sign of hope. At least it seems that their internal data led them to change policy, and so anytime you see people actually, whether they're right or wrong, but they're responding to data, and I like to see that. Um, so some people have pointed to that as a sign that things are changing. I don't know. I've generally not been very optimistic because the trends that I've seen taking place seem to there seems to be no reason that they would reverse, and and a lot of a lot of things have been institutionalized, in the last few years that will continue to have consequences on down the road. So I don't know. I think it's sometimes there's signs that it may be opening up a bit, new kinds of ideas, new perspectives on social justice, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I like your final section there in the book on humility. Just intellectual humility. I could be wrong. But one of my favorite quotes from Thomas Sowell is, "There are no solutions; they're just compromises. Can't have everything, right?" Abortion issue. You have pro-life, pro-choice. There's not a correct answer, really. It's more of a political question. So you just fight for your side, or trans rights. So I support trans rights or human rights. Well, wait a minute. You want to have a guy who transitioned to a woman compete against women? No, that's not fair to the women, right? We can't have everything. Sorry, and if we can recognize that we're not going to have utopia. That's a big way of like relaxing your moral outrage dial, I guess. As to calm things down a little bit.
Also, there's realizing that there are always some kind of trade-offs, and mostly what other people are doing is simply making different trade-offs than you. They might be wrong in how they're perceiving it, but usually people don't have completely, just sort of completely different value systems. They're just looking at balancing things differently.
Yeah, I think about that with the abortion issue. I'm a pro-choicer. I don't like what's happened. But on the other hand, they've worked at it for 50 years. Remember back in the 80s when there was the bombing the abortion clinics and killing the abortion doctors? They realized this is not helping our cause. We have to do something else. We got to change the law through getting judges and so on. They did it. All right, so our side needs to do the same thing. Just, kind of chip away at it, and that's how it works. All right, Bradley, thanks so much for your work. Here it is again, How to Think Better About Social Justice. Very good contribution. Thanks for talking. We'll get back on in a couple of years and see if the tide has turned yet.
Thank you for having me on. I enjoyed it.